The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets as Mikhail, a 28-year-old black man, cycled down a wide, tree-lined avenue. He had just finished delivering groceries to his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Campbell, a widow who often relied on him for help. The bike he rode was his pride and joy, an old but well-maintained model with a metallic blue finish and the initials JW engraved on the frame. It had belonged to his best friend he also calls brother, Jason, who had tragically passed away 5 years earlier. Mikhail had inherited it as a keepsake, a tangible memory of the brotherhood they shared. Mikhail is a mechanic who runs a small auto repair shop in the community. Known for his quiet demeanor and hard-working nature, he pours his energy into his work while finding solace in cycling. As he pedaled through the calm streets, a police cruiser slowed down beside him. The officer inside, a middle-aged white man named Officer Harris West, rolled down the window and gestured for Mikhail to stop. Officer Harris had been patrolling the neighborhood for years, and while he wasn't overtly hostile, his interactions with residents of color often carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Before we continue with this story, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for your support. Step off the bike, Officer Harris ordered as he pulled over and stepped out of the vehicle. Mikhail hesitated. Is there a problem, officer? That bike looks like it might not belong to you, Officer Harris said, his tone firm. We've had reports of stolen bikes in the area. Let's see some ID. Mikhail frowned, dismounting the bike. This is my bike. I've had it for years. Officer Harris's eyes narrowed. Let me be the judge of that. Mikhail handed over his ID, trying to remain calm despite the heat rising in his chest. Officer Harris examined it briefly, then turned his attention to the bike. He ran his fingers over the initials on the frame and frowned. What are these? Officer Harris asked, tapping the engraved letters. They're the initials of my best friend and brother. He passed away, and the bike was left to me. Convenient story, Officer Harris muttered. Without waiting for an explanation, he grabbed the bike and began inspecting it more closely, handling it with a carelessness that made Mikhail wince. This isn't necessary, Mikhail said, his voice tinged with frustration. I've done nothing wrong. Mikhail lives alone in a modest home, maintaining a strong sense of independence. While he does not currently have a family of his own, he is deeply rooted in the neighborhood, with close relationships with community members, particularly the youth. Officer Harris ignored him, yanking the bike's handlebars so hard that they loosened. Mikhail stepped forward instinctively, his hands raised. Please don't damage it, it's sentimental. Officer Harris glared at him, mistaking Michael's plea for aggression. Back up, he barked, shoving Mikhail away. The commotion drew the attention of a few passers-by, who began filming with their phones. As tensions escalated, Officer Harris's grip on the bike slipped, causing it to fall to the ground with a metallic clang. One of the wheels bent under the impact, and the engraved initials became scratched. Mikhail froze, his eyes glued to the bike. You had no right, Mikhail exclaimed, his voice cracking. Before Officer Harris could respond, another officer arrived on the scene. Officer Jenkins, a younger cop with a more measured demeanor, stepped out of the car. What's going on here? She asked, glancing between Mikhail and Officer Harris. He's riding a bike that might be stolen, Officer Harris said curtly. Officer Jenkins looked at the damaged bike, then at Michael's distraught expression. Sir, she asked Mikhail, do you have any proof that this bike is yours? Mikhail reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photo. It showed him and Jason as teenagers, grinning ear to ear, with the metallic blue bike standing proudly between them. Officer Jenkins examined it closely. This matches the initials, Officer Jenkins said softly, showing the photo to Officer Harris. I think there's been a mistake. Officer Harris's expression faltered. He stared at the photo, then at the bike. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. JW, he whispered, that's Jason West. Mikhail, still visibly upset, demanded an explanation. What do you mean? You recognize the initials? Officer Harris's face paled. My younger brother. Jason. The air grew heavy with silence. McKill stared at Officer Harris, incredulous. Your brother? Jason was your brother? Officer Harris nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. We were estranged for years. I didn't even know what happened to his things after he passed. Emotion surged in McKill. This bike meant everything to him. And you just destroyed it. Officer Harris looked down at the bent wheel, guilt washing over him. I didn't know. Officer Jenkins intervened. Officer Harris, you need to take responsibility for this. Apologize, and do what you can to make it right. I'm sorry, Officer Harris said, his voice thick with remorse. I'll pay for the repairs, and anything else you need. Michael's anger didn't dissipate immediately, but as the scene unfolded, the crowd that had gathered began murmuring. Some expressed support for McKill, while others questioned the systemic biases that led to the incident in the first place. One vivid memory McKill holds is Jason excitedly showing him tricks he'd learned on the bike and their laughter as they raced through the park trails. This whole incident renewed the wound he'd been nursing since Jason passed. In the weeks that followed, Officer Harris kept his word. He paid for the bike's repairs and even had the initials re-engraved, this time with a protective coating to preserve them. The experience humbled him, forcing him to confront his own prejudices and how they shaped his actions as an officer. Meanwhile, Officer Harris, already grappling with guilt, used the opportunity to reach out to McKill personally. McKill, though hesitant at first, eventually agreed to sit down with Officer Harris. Offering an apology, Officer Harris vowed to make amends. Though initially skeptical, McKill recognized Officer Harris's sincerity over time, and their collaboration on justice initiatives eventually became a symbol of redemption and reconciliation. The two men shared stories about Jason, finding common ground in their shared love for the man who had touched both their lives. Their conversation sparked a tentative understanding, a small step toward healing the wounds of their initial encounter. It also marked the beginning of an unlikely partnership between McKill and Officer Harris, united in their pursuit of justice and change for Jason and others like him. The video of the incident, which had initially gone viral, attracts public backlash which was swift and unforgiving. This prompted the police department to review its protocols and implement mandatory bias training. Although there was no reprimand for his action, the police department confirmed that Officer Harris had realized his mistakes and had fixed the bike as he had promised. For McKill, the journey was far from over, but he found solace in knowing that Jason's memory had played a role in creating change. As McKill pedaled down the familiar streets, the weight of the recent events still lingered, but the glimmers of hope that emerged kept him moving forward. The bike, now restored and more polished than ever, symbolized more than just Jason's memory. It was a testament to the bridges that could be built even after bitter conflict. Officer Harris didn't just stop at repairing the bike. Feeling the need to make a more profound amends, he worked with McKill to start a local youth mentorship program in Jason's name. The program focused on fostering understanding and collaboration between law enforcement and the community. It aimed to provide young people with opportunities for growth, and it was a space where they could learn about justice, equity, and the importance of shared stories. At the first gathering of the program, Officer Harris stood before a small group of teens, alongside McKill. His uniform looked the same, but his demeanor had shifted. I made mistakes, Officer Harris began, his voice steady. And those mistakes taught me lessons that I want to share with all of you. Everyone deserves respect, and everyone has a story worth hearing. McKill followed, gripping the bike's handlebars for support as he spoke. This bike belonged to my best friend, Jason. It's more than just metal and wheels, it represents a bond, a legacy. And today, I'm riding it forward, in the hopes that his story inspires all of you. The kids in the crowd, some of whom had witnessed police bias firsthand, nodded with quiet understanding. The small but significant gathering marked the beginning of a new chapter for the community, one rooted in unity and understanding. Meanwhile, the viral video of the confrontation between McKill and Officer Harris continued to make waves. News outlets picked up the story, initially focusing on the heated exchange and the symbolism of the bike. However, as the story evolved, the narrative shifted to one of redemption and reconciliation. McKill and Officer Harris appeared together in interviews, emphasizing the importance of dialogue and accountability. One particular interview stood out. A young reporter asked McKill, "Why did you agree to work with Officer Harris after what happened?" McKill paused, the weight of the question evident in his eyes. "Because change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we face the hard truths together and decide to build something better." As for Officer Harris, the incident served as a turning point in his career. His willingness to confront his own biases and take steps to make amends didn't erase the harm he had caused, but it earned him a measure of respect from both his peers and the community. He became a vocal advocate for police reform, ensuring that his actions spoke louder than his regrets. The story's ripple effects extended far beyond the neighborhood. Communities across the country took note of how a seemingly small incident, a bike, an encounter, a misunderstanding, could spark broader conversations about justice and humanity. Other police departments reached out to McKill and Officer Harris, seeking guidance on implementing similar mentorship programs. In the end, the most profound impact was on McKill himself. Riding Jason's bike once felt like a solitary tribute, but now, it carried the weight of a movement. He often found himself surrounded by young kids eager to hear his story and learn how they, too, could stand up for what's right. One afternoon, as McKill rode through the park where he and Jason had spent countless hours as kids, he felt a strange sense of peace. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden hues over the path. A group of children raced by on their bikes, laughing and cheering. One of them stopped and pointed to Michael's bike. "That's a cool ride," the boy exclaimed. "Where'd you get it?" McKill smiled, the memories flooding back. It was a gift from a friend, a reminder that we all have the power to create change. As he watched the boy pedal away, McKill realized that the journey wasn't just about honoring Jason's memory. It was about forging new paths, inspiring others, and ensuring that no story, no matter how painful, was ever left untold. One evening, McKill was cycling home from the mentorship program's community center when the sound of tires screeching on pavement jolted him. A black sedan had pulled sharply into his path, cutting him off. He barely managed to brake in time, his hands gripping the handlebars so tightly his knuckles turned white. The driver's door opened, and Officer Harris stepped out, his face pale but determined. This wasn't the Officer Harris McKill had come to know, the one who had worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and accountability. Something was wrong. "McKill," Officer Harris said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk. Now." McKill dismounted from the bike, wary. "What's going on?" Officer Harris glanced around the quiet street, his eyes scanning for anyone who might overhear. "I found something," he began. "About Jason's death." McKill froze. For years, Jason's passing had been shrouded in unanswered questions. Officially, it was ruled an accident, but McKill had always felt something was off. Officer Harris's sudden revelation felt like a crack in a long-sealed door. "What do you mean?" McKill demanded, his voice sharp. Officer Harris stepped closer, his tone hushed. "I went through old case files. There's evidence that Jason didn't just crash his bike. He was chased." The words hit McKill like a physical blow. "Chased? By who?" "That's the thing," Officer Harris said, his expression dark. "The report mentions witnesses who saw a car tailing him aggressively, but it was buried. It never made it into the final investigation. Someone wanted this covered up." Michael's heart raced, anger bubbling to the surface. "Why are you just telling me this now?" "Because I didn't know," Officer Harris replied, guilt heavy in his voice. "I should have looked deeper before. But now that I have, I'm not letting it go." McKill stared at Officer Harris, his mind spinning. Jason's death wasn't an accident, it was something far more sinister. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, but so did a sense of determination. "What do we do?" Mikhail asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. We go to the station, Officer Harris said. And we demand answers. But you need to be ready. Whoever buried this had a reason, and they won't want us digging it up. Mikhail nodded, his grip tightening on the handlebars of Jason's bike. I've been ready for this since the day Jason died. Together, they headed to the station, the air crackling with tension. When they arrived, Officer Harris used his badge to gain access to the archives. The room was dimly lit, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence as Officer Harris sifted through files. Here, he said, pulling out a folder marked with Jason's name. The report was thin, too thin for a case involving a fatality. Officer Harris flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, a handwritten note from a witness claiming they'd seen a black SUV chasing Jason moments before his crash. Mikhail clenched his fists. And they ignored this? Why? Before Officer Harris could answer, the door slammed open, and a senior officer strode in, his face a mask of barely contained anger. What are you two doing here? We're reopening a case, Officer Harris said, standing his ground. And we're not leaving until we get the truth. The senior officer's eyes darted to the folder in Officer Harris's hands, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of panic. That case is closed, he snapped. You're overstepping. Mikhail stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. If you have nothing to hide, why are you so nervous? The senior officer glared at him but said nothing. Officer Harris took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. We're not going away. If you think you can intimidate us, think again. The room fell into a charged silence, the weight of the confrontation hanging in the air. Michael's heart pounded, but he refused to back down. For the first time in years, he felt like justice for Jason was within reach, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The senior officer's glare hardened as he stared at Officer Harris and Mikhail, his jaw tight. You're playing a dangerous game, Officer Harris, he said, his voice low but threatening. You have no idea how deep this goes. Officer Harris refused to be intimidated. I'm not the one playing games. We're talking about burying evidence in a fatality case, a young man's life, Jason's life. If you think I'm walking away from this, you're wrong. The tension in the room was palpable. Mikhail stepped closer to the senior officer. This isn't just about Jason. It's about the system you're protecting. If you think I'm afraid of you or your threats, think again. The officer's lips tightened into a thin line. Fine, he said abruptly, his tone almost dismissive. You want to make this official? Let's take it to the chief. Officer Harris's eyebrows raised slightly. Gladly. The three of them marched through the station, attracting stares from other officers. Mikhail could feel his pulse quickening, his resolve solidifying. Officer Harris led them to the chief's office, his knock sharp and deliberate. Come in, came a deep voice from inside. The chief of police was a towering man in his late 50s, his presence commanding the room. He looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he saw Officer Harris, Mikhail, and the senior officer. What's going on here? The chief asked, his tone firm. Officer Harris placed the folder on the chief's desk. We're here about Jason West's case. Evidence was buried, and we need it reopened. The chief's face darkened as he flipped through the folder. This case was closed years ago, he said, his voice laced with frustration. What's your angle here, Officer Harris? The truth, Officer Harris replied simply. Witness statements were ignored, and the case was swept under the rug. We deserve answers. The chief leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to the senior officer. And you're involved in this how? The senior officer's composure faltered. He began, but Officer Harris cut him off. He's part of the cover-up, Officer Harris said, his voice sharp. And I'm willing to bet this isn't the only case where evidence has been tampered with. The room fell into silence, the weight of the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Mikhail spoke next, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. My best friend and brother didn't deserve to die like this. and he sure didn't deserve to have his case buried. The chief's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. He reached for his phone, dialing a number. "I'm calling Internal Affairs. If there's any truth to these claims, we'll find out." The senior officer paled, his bravado crumbling. "Chief, you don't." "I do," the chief snapped. "If there's corruption in this department, I'll root it out." McKell and Officer Harris exchanged a glance, a glimmer of hope breaking through the tension. This was far from over, but it was a step in the right direction. In the weeks that followed, Internal Affairs launched a full investigation into Jason's case and others like it. The senior officer was suspended pending further review, and whispers of deeper corruption began to surface. Officer Harris and McKell continued to work together, their bond growing stronger as they fought for justice, not just for Jason, but for others whose voices had been silenced. When the truth finally came to light, it was revealed that Jason's death had been the result of a reckless chase orchestrated by officers who were never held accountable. The public outcry was immediate, forcing the department to implement sweeping reforms. McKell, inspired by the journey and supported by Officer Harris, started a foundation in Jason's name to support families seeking justice. Officer Harris, too, became a vocal advocate for accountability within the police force. As they stood together at the foundation's opening ceremony, McKell held Jason's bike in one hand and a plaque in the other. "This is for Jason," he said, his voice unwavering. "And for everyone who deserves justice." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the power of resilience, truth, and hope. By the time McKell rode his restored bike through the neighborhood again, the metallic blue frame gleaming in the sunlight, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The bike wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a symbol of resilience, connection, and the power of shared humanity, even in the face of conflict. What do you think about the accidental partnership between McKell and Officer Harris? Share your thoughts in the comments section. If you appreciate this story, please like and share with your family and friends, and do not forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories.